Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's national webinar presented by the GAIN Center with SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and their Families Technical Assistance Center. Today's webinar is supporting justice-involved service members and veterans through early interventions in criminal justice settings. Today's presenters are Dwayne France, Lieutenant Nicholas Grant, and Dr. Maria Kelbler, and I will introduce them shortly. I'm Angela Wright. I'm a Senior Project Associate at SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and their Families Technical Assistance Center. I'm an Air Force veteran as well, and I'm really thrilled to be here today moderating this session. You'll see a chat box at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, to share where you're joining from. I'm joining from upstate New York, just outside of Albany. And before we start our presentations, I have some introductory items I'd like to review with you. First, a quick disclaimer. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. All right. Well, just a few reminders we would like to go over today. If you have any questions for the presenters regarding the technology, please type them into the Q&A pod found on the bottom of your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'll address as many of your questions as time permits. There will be polls periodically, so if you would please respond to the polls as they pop up throughout the event. And when you see them pop up on the screen, you can select your answers, and then we'll review the responses as soon as folks have responded. All right. We'll give you a few minutes to respond to this poll. While you do that, I'll share a few other reminders. We are going to be recording this webinar. Everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive notification from the GAIN Center when the video is available for viewing on SAMHSA's Criminal Justice YouTube channel. Slides will also be disseminated to all webinar registrants in the weeks following the webinar. You will also receive a certificate of attendance that will be available for download at the end of the webinar. This is for your own personal portfolio use, and this webinar is not eligible for CEU credits. As you'll notice, we have ASL interpretation for this event, and we're really pleased to have with us today Pamela Mitchell and Jabiral Param as our interpreters for today. There is also live captioning for today's event. To view live captioning, please click on Live Transcript CC, then select Show Subtitles. All right. Let's go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. So I'm really thrilled and pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dwayne France. He is the co-director of SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and their Families Technical Assistance Center at Policy Research Associates. He is a retired Army non-commissioned officer, a combat veteran, and a clinical mental health counselor with a 22-year military career and expertise in the mental health and wellness needs of service members, veterans, and their families. Next, we have Dr. Maria Kelbler. She is a research psychologist and section chief for evidence synthesis and dissemination at the Defense Health Agency Psychological Health Center of Excellence. Her research focuses on mental health of military service members. Also joining us today is Lieutenant Nicholas Grant. He is a clinical psychology subject matter expert in the Research Adoption section of the Defense Health Agency Psychological Health Center of Excellence. He completed a tour as the Embedded Mental Health Officer for Commander Naval Service Group Middle Pacific, leading psychological care for the sailors. In 2022, he was selected by the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations 21st Century Sailor Office as a fellow in the International Career Advancement Program. Please welcome our esteemed speakers. Okay, there is a poll that is opened up on the window. Let's go ahead and see what folks have responded with. All right, just scrolling through here, I see that we have about half of folks joining us that are focused on urban areas. Many folks from corrections, probation, parole, government policy, community-based providers. Lots of folks joining from the judiciary. So welcome to everyone. We're so glad that you're here and are joining us for this webinar. All right, next I would like to turn things over to our first speaker, Dwayne France. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate all of you introducing yourselves in the chat. I would be remiss if I did not shout out to several of my colleagues from Colorado. I am a licensed professional counselor in Colorado. Some of what Angela didn't share is a lot of my clinical work was with the Colorado 4th Judicial District Veterans Court. So those of you in Colorado Springs, Colorado, if you are engaging with Judge David Shakes and his court, amazing program. And I see some folks from Sterling too. You're going to hear a little bit about some, you're going to hear me talk about you because I really love the work that's being done there in Colorado and across the U.S. to support veterans involved in the criminal legal system. Today, I'm going to talk at a really high level about military culture, go over some specific things that individuals engaging veterans, service members and veterans in the criminal justice system, talking about how to identify service members and veterans, military and culture training resources, key partnerships. Really want to talk a little bit about some common clinical considerations, why that's important, and then briefly touch on the 3 different aspects of supporting veterans in the judicial system, things like veterans courts, but also support in non-veteran court settings. Some support in local corrections, in local jails, and then in long-term corrections and in correctional facilities. So that's really an overview of what we're going to talk about. You will be getting these slides later. You're going to see some links. You're going to see some QR codes, but we will make sure that you get all this information as we go through. First, as Angela mentioned, as my colleagues mentioned, a number of us are former military or current military. When we talk about culture and multiculturalism in the aspect of clinical mental health, I always want to ensure that people understand that military culture is a different culture. By any definition of culture, the military is an occupational culture that is separate and distinct. Things like the integrated pattern of human knowledge belief that transmit from succeeding generations, characteristic features of everyday existence shared by people, place, or time, or the shared attitudes, values, and goals. People who serve in the military experience and develop a type of culture, a way of thinking, a mindset. We have our own way of dressing, obviously. When we were in the military, we have our own language. I speak both expletive and acronym fluently. You know that you are talking to another veteran when a veteran expresses themselves, and it is an occupational culture that is sometimes intersectional with our individual lived cultures. Really, when I talk about mental health and military culture, I like to really help people understand that if we talk about cultural competence, that's not a destination to get to. This is probably one of the best ways that I've seen the concept of cultural engagement is first being aware that there is another type of culture. In this case, being aware that the military is a separate culture. And then starting to develop some cultural knowledge. You do that through lived experience, as a number of us have done, a number of you likely have done, I've seen in the chat. You gain cultural knowledge by living within that culture and developing experience within that culture, or you develop cultural knowledge by learning things about that culture, do that from the outside. In my experience as a clinical mental health professional, a lot of people think that once I gain cultural knowledge, that makes me culturally competent. But really, you need to take that a step further. Need to be able to develop sensitivity towards that culture and really to be able to engage that culture in a trusting and open way and really function appropriately. I frequently say you do not need to be a veteran to be in the clinical mental health field. in my case specifically, simply because to serve veterans in mental health. There's not enough of us in the clinical mental health field who had previously served with lived experience. So really it is necessary for those with lived experience to support our clinical colleagues who don't have lived experience in developing some of that cultural responsivity. Really, when you're talking about, one of the first things I want to talk about engaging veterans in the criminal justice space is first identifying veterans. You have to be able to identify who are the veterans within your system. We always recommend that you ask a question, have you or a loved one ever served in the military? That is a very different question than have you ever served in the Army or the Marines, or even if are you or a veteran. But have you or a loved one ever served in the military allows you to be able to identify if you have service members for some populations or veterans within your community. And that can look differently in a number of different things. In court settings, identifying service members, veterans, and their families at first appearance or as soon as possible provides an opportunity to connect to resources. My first Colorado reference here is Colorado actually passed a law a number of years ago requiring an inquiry at first appearance about whether or not the individual is a veteran. That then enables the judge or the magistrate to be able to say, did you know there was a veterans court, or there are resources here for you in the community. Community correction settings. If you're a county jails or you have community corrections in that way, identifying service members and veterans during intake or registration allows for community providers to easily identify individuals for support. Again, example of the El Paso County, Colorado jail. If for any given day we had anywhere from 140 to probably about 180 service members and veterans incarcerated, because the jail system was actually asking that question and tracking that as a very specific answer, and was able to communicate that to community providers so community providers could engage with those veterans. And then very similarly in state and federal correction settings, identifying service members, veterans during intake or reception allows for specific questions and ongoing support to inmates who are incarcerated. I saw in the chat a colleague from Sterling, Colorado, the correctional facility, the penitentiary there, actually has a veteran cell block. I'll talk about that concept here in a minute. And I've been able to visit that and talk to some of the veterans there. And that was made possible because while they were entering into the system, they were identified, and then they moved through the process and were able to engage with that. So the first thing, probably the most critical thing, is identifying the service member, veteran, or family member. The second thing to understand is that there are explicit and implicit aspects of service that you need to be able to understand. There are things that are very observable. You'll see Lieutenant Grant as he comes in later. He is wearing his uniform. You can tell by his uniform what his branch of service is, what type of service, what his rank is, whether he's officer enlisted. So these are very obvious things that are external aspects of military culture. Those aspects don't often continue beyond service. As good as Lieutenant Grant looks in his uniform, he's probably not going to continue to wear that after he leaves the military, nor did I, nor did Angela. And so those explicit aspects of service are not always visible, but implicit aspects of military culture are really ingrained in service members and veterans, and they become a part of core values after the service. Things like commitment, honor, sacrifice, putting the needs of others before self, pride of service, familiarity and comfort with structure and hierarchy. Sometimes this may not be congruent with someone who is in the criminal justice system. They might have some stress related to their military culture aspects, and then what the situation they find themselves in. But then also things like the familiarity and comfort of a veterans court, for example, might be beneficial for veterans as they work through their criminal justice situations. Mental health and stigma in the criminal legal system is pretty significant. Sort of want to talk a little bit about four aspects here. One, stigma against help seeking. It is, I always say a veteran doesn't need a very good reason to avoid therapy. Any reason is a good reason. Sometimes just the internalized, I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be seen as somebody who can't be relied upon, or I used to be able to do this and I can't do that. But then there's also the externalized stigma of the John Rambo and crazy combat vet mentality of somebody judging a veteran or potentially judging a veteran because they're seeking mental health support. Shame and embarrassment is another significant aspect of engaging with veterans in the criminal legal system, because what has happened might violate their own personal values. They never saw themselves in this situation of being in front of a judge or being incarcerated. And then it might also violate those military values. They might receive judgment from their peers who served with them. And now, they were upholding a certain standard within the military, but now they violated that standard, and there might be judgment there. Exposure to traumatic events is very, very significant. The military is an inherently dangerous occupation. The training that you go through, the experiences that you have while in the military, by definition, is and can lead to traumatic exposure. And so what is the impacts of that trauma? We'll talk a little bit about some of the common clinical concerns that many veterans face. But then what are the coping mechanisms that some service members and veterans will fall back on to be able to react to that trauma? Whether it's substance use behavior, isolation, things that, or aggressive behavior, which could have been what landed them in the situation that led them into the criminal justice system. And then finally, barriers to treatment. Once you leave the military, how is that mental health treatment accessed? Does that individual have access? One of the things that is very significant related to access to treatment is, what is the characterization of discharge? Perhaps misbehavior started in the military. Characterization of discharge limits their access or had previously limited their access to some treatment through the Department of Veterans Affairs. And then if they are engaging in that, is the outcomes, if they're engaging in treatment, are the outcomes beneficial to support them? So really thinking about a lot of these different aspects of what a service member brings into the criminal legal system. If you are not someone who has previous lived experience, and you find yourself working with veterans, definitely recommend that you explore military culture training. There are a number of different resources that are available. The train.org, the VHA Train platform, has a number of military culture trainings that you can access. The Center for Deployment Psychology is another excellent resource. They have a series of modules on helping individuals without lived experience to learn more about military culture. And at the SNV-FTA Center, we always recommend exploring psycharmor.org. That's a nonprofit that specifically supports community members, clinicians, anyone who supports service members and veterans to learn more about military culture. Again, you'll be able to get some of these links when you get the slides, but definitely recommend that you reach out and consider how you might incorporate these military culture trainings for members of your staff or members of your organization that don't have lived experience in the military. Another thing that is absolutely critical, it was critical for us when I was working with the 4th Judicial District and veteran courts across the country, is the Department of Veterans Affairs. The majority of the veterans that are being seen in the community criminal justice space are supported by the VA. And so really very specifically, veteran justice outreach coordinators are key partners when it comes to supporting individuals in the criminal justice system. They are likely, in my experience, they are involved quite closely with many, if not all, the veterans courts. But if you are in a different correctional setting, then there is the ability in this link to be able to see if there is a veteran justice outreach coordinator near you. But the VA is very much a very strong resource. Other resources include suicide prevention coordinators. They coordinate outreach and case management for veterans at high risk for suicide. of which one of the risk factors is being involved in the criminal legal system. Local recovery coordinators. These are also individuals that are community facing and engaging. Vet centers are definitely, they're community-based mental health clinics, reside a little bit outside of the main VA structure. And so many vet centers are co-located in jurisdictions with veterans courts. And so engaging vet centers, and then also VA community engagement partnership coordinators. These are individuals within communities that are specifically designed to be able to support coalition building for suicide prevention. So finding partners within the Department of Veterans Affairs is also critical as you're supporting service members and veterans in the court system. Now I'd like to go into clinical diagnoses, neurological conditions, and psychological constructs related to mental health and wellness in service members and veterans. If you are not clinical, this is not intended to say that you need to be clinical, but if you are working with veterans in the criminal legal system, you really should understand that these factors are there, what they look like, or at least be able to make referrals related to this. We do want to make one caveat, though, is just because these are common doesn't mean they're ubiquitous. Not every veteran experiences this. A study from Fogel in 2020 found that although a significant minority of veterans screen positive for mental health conditions, the majority are psychologically resilient. So as I go through this, that's not to say that all veterans have whatever we're about to talk about. And so really need to understand that just because someone is a veteran doesn't mean they have these conditions. However, they may be likely. So really, I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. It's going to be a lot coming at you. Again, you'll get the slides afterwards. And this is really sort of a way to look at the broad mental health conditions that are frequently seen in service members and veterans. This is not meant to be inclusive, nor is this meant to be segmented where only one thing is happening, only another thing is happening. If you look at post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, one is psychological reaction to psychological reaction to trauma. The other is a physical injury. Quite often, traumatic events psychologically are also physically traumatic. And so you might see traumatic brain injury, substance use, PTSD co-occurring within a particular individual. The first thing really many people think of when they think about veteran mental health is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's really important to understand that PTSD is a clinical diagnosis and it requires a specific set of clinical criteria. So it's one thing to be able to say, well, veterans say, well, I have PTSD, but is there a clinical diagnosis? Do they meet the clinical definition of post-traumatic stress disorder? If they don't, if there is another mental health concern, then perhaps we need to take another approach with that individual, because treating someone for PTSD when they don't have PTSD, there's another underlying condition that you might need to be able to address. The other thing that many people now, especially in the last 25 years, is traumatic brain injury. It is a physical injury to the brain, a disruption of the normal function of the brain that can be caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head or penetrating injury. As I mentioned before, the military is an inherently dangerous place. I went to Iraq, 2 tours to Afghanistan, but I got a concussion in the late 90s, jumping out of an airplane at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Thankfully, I did not have any of the long-term effects of traumatic brain injury, but falls, vehicular accidents, those kind of things, just because someone had never experienced combat doesn't mean that they might not have experienced TBI. The other thing very specifically is over the last 25 to 30 years, we've seen the survivability of catastrophic events increase, which means when mortality decreases, fewer people are dying, but there is a greater likelihood that there is some type of catastrophic injury. And so we have better medical response, better equipment that keeps us from experiencing fatalities, but there is an increased likelihood of traumatic brain injury. So if your organization, court, or system is not exploring or at least screening for traumatic brain injuries, it would be recommended to do so. Substance use and addiction. This is something that is very commonly seen in the criminal justice system. Again, going back to that place of whether or not we use substances to cope. And beyond just substances, things like compulsive viewing of sexually explicit materials or gambling. The 2022 NISDA study showed that veterans with an SUD, 27% struggle with illicit drug use, 82 with alcohol use, and 9.5 with both. The opioid epidemic in the veteran population started when we were in the military. Again, jumping out of airplanes 37 too many times. I have a lot of pain. Many veterans continue to have a lot of pain after their military service. Next, mood disorders and really broadly thinking about anger, anxiety, and depression. These disorders have a broad range of causes, genetics, adverse childhood experiences, exposure to trauma, prior military service. Exposures or experiences during the military can also generate these conditions. Someone may have developed major depressive disorder not due to exposure from combat, but due to systematic harassment, for example, or other military occupational stressors. So just because someone does not have PTSD does not mean that there might not be other military-related conditions. Typically, anger, anxiety, depression can really lead to some of the disrupted emotions and situations that lead somebody to be involved in the criminal legal system. Moral injury is something that has really developed since the mid-90s, and it's defined as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. If we can talk about PTSD very broadly and not necessarily clinically as a psychological injury, although it has neurological impacts, and traumatic brain injury is a physical injury, moral injury has been described as an injury of the soul. What I change or what I have seen, what I've experienced in the military have caused me to change how I believe right and wrong is in the world. This was first developed by Dr. Jonathan Shea in the mid-90s and really talks about the patterns of shame and guilt related to actions taken or not taken when faced with traumatic events. So again, this is something that is really being seen in the veteran population, and the struggles related to this is something else in addition to the diagnoses that we just talked about. Some service members and veterans experience distress and discomfort just leaving the military, leaving the highly regimented, communal, significantly resourced military community to a less defined, individualistic, and less clearly resourced life after the military can be challenging. I had veteran clients that just say they were lost. This also has to do with whether or not how we get our needs met. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of the needs, in the military, our needs were met. My social group was given to me, my housing was given to me, my food was given to me. Once I left the military after 22 years, I had to do all those things on my own. Some service members and veterans might struggle with that, meeting those basic needs. And if they are struggling with things like housing insecurity or employment insecurity, financial instability, well, that can be a problem. A colleague of mine in Colorado often like to say it's very hard to talk about your inner child if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight. And that can be a struggle for a lot of veterans. A sense of purpose and meaning is huge. Every veteran that I've ever worked with in the clinical space really struggles with, how do I find the same level, or how do I find equivalent purpose and meaning in my life after I leave the military? Dr. Irvin Yalom, and this is very definitely within existential psychology, Dr. Irvin Yalom identified that people are extraordinarily comforted by the belief that there's some coherent pattern to life and that each individual has some particular role to play in that design. Now, Dr. Yalom wasn't talking about the military, but that's a pretty good definition of the military from my perspective. And a lot of service members and veterans don't find that they have that level of purpose and meaning after the military, and then they struggle in some ways. And then finally, relationships. Our mental health impacts our relationships, and our relationships impact our mental health. Isolation is a significant factor when it comes to coping with mental health concerns. And so strong and connected relationships are critical for when we're trying to support service members and veterans. Now, thinking about these are clinical diagnoses. These are listed in the DSM. There is significant research in both the condition and the evidence-based practices. It's not limited to military experience. Traumatic brain injuries in Colorado, again, coming from skiing accidents, or PTSD from assaults or vehicle accidents, or substance use and addiction is not just limited to the military. There is insurance coverage for these for mental health treatment, and there is disability compensation available if these conditions are service related. These conditions, however, really are beyond just PTSD and traumatic brain injury, is being described as transition stress. Doctors Mobbs and Bonanno talked about this as the strain experienced by military veterans as they adjust from military to civilian life. These really are things that are may not be clinical as far as clearly defined in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, but they all exist nonetheless. There are variable amounts of research, but they have a significant impact on what mental health and well-being. They may be a little bit more prevalent in the military due to the levels of self-identification, dedication to service, and some of those other values. And maybe there's not medications, for example. There's no pill to help me have a better relationship, because my wife would probably make sure that I got some of those pills, right? But these aren't kind of things that you can just medicate. These are things that are in different ways. Needs fulfillment, you have to engage with employment professionals and financial service professionals. Moral injury has a strong spiritual component. Perhaps there's someone from a faith community that can support. So really thinking about this entire collection of conditions when you're working with veterans. So as I start to wrap up here, want to talk a little bit about each of the three settings: veterans courts, community correctional settings, and then long-term incarceration. What some of the systems are. I see a number of you work with veteran treatment courts. Veteran treatment courts have been around since 2008. Judge Robert Russell in Buffalo, New York, is largely credited for some of the initial, the very first veterans court. But they provide justice-involved veterans with the structure, accountability, and treatment mentoring needed to repair their lives. One of the biggest things that I saw when I was working with veteran courts is they are a multidisciplinary team. And so it is a group, a collaborative effort that comes together to support veterans that are in those courts. However, we recognize that not all jurisdictions across the U.S. have veterans courts. So here are a number of examples for jurisdictions that are in non-VTC settings that are supporting veterans. There are veteran dockets in general courts, so they're in a general court system, but veteran-specific dockets, not a separate court. The state of New York has conditional discharge or diversion agreements for veterans as they complete a particular system. Sentencing mitigation based on veteran status. Washington State has a statute related to that. And then collaborative and wellness courts that include veterans as part of larger community wellness efforts. And so if you're in a jurisdiction that does not have a veteran court, there's still opportunities to engage in supporting veterans in the court system. My colleagues from Colorado will likely recognize this is a picture from the El Paso County Jail. The El Paso County, Colorado Jail has a veterans ward. And the veterans ward is I think it was 70 to 75 beds of just veterans. Veterans wards are cell blocks in community correctional facilities or dedicated housing units within local jails and detention centers that group incarcerated veterans together in a structured military-informed environment. I frequently would go to jail on Tuesdays and go to court on Thursdays. But I would go into the local jail, and I would talk to veterans, support them as they're working through their criminal legal situation, as well as supporting them with my colleagues in the VJO to get them treatment afterwards. These initiatives are in a number of community-based correctional facilities throughout the country. And so this is definitely one thing that could be beneficial. If there is not a necessary veteran ward or cell block, there are other examples of peer support of wellness programs for veterans and community corrections. Albany County, New York has a peer support network that engages veterans who are incarcerated in Albany County jails. Inside jail informational clinics, Riverside County, California, there's an example of actually going in and providing a claims clinic or an informational clinic about resources for veterans once they leave the facility. And then trauma-informed group therapies. Cocochino County in Arizona Exodus program is one that even if there is not a veteran-specific grouping, that there are resources for veterans within the jail system. And then next are our state and federal facilities, veteran-specific dorms and housing units. For my colleagues in Sterling, I wanted to share the wealth. I was going to highlight Sterling, but I wanted to share the wealth outside of Colorado. But again, having visited Sterling Correctional Facility and experiencing their veteran housing unit, it is another great example of veteran-specific dorms organized into military-style squads or groups. The example here is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice have veteran reentry dorms. There's a female veterans unit. There's a male veterans unit at Travis State Jail. And again, this is allowing veterans to experience some of that camaraderie, some of that connectedness, but also a little bit of that policing each other up that is typical in the military. And again, additional state veteran housing units are in Missouri, Virginia, Florida, Washington, Georgia, and of course, Colorado. The one thing that's really important that is necessary for people to understand that there is an impact of incarceration on VA benefits. And so if a veteran is incarcerated, there is an impact on what their VA benefits can be. Disability compensation is suspended if they're incarcerated for over 60 days. The 20%, and then the rating reduces to 10%. 10% rating gets halved, or over 20% gets reduced to 10. 10% or lower gets halved. Payments are unreleased. Payments resume upon release. For pensions are terminated after 60 days of incarceration. Some of these benefits may be apportioned to eligible dependents during the veteran's incarceration. But again, this is a very important reason why you need to partner with Veteran Justice Outreach, because you need somebody who can support that veteran engaging in accessing their benefits. And then finally, education benefits. If veterans are in a long-term correctional facility, how they navigate their benefits is really a challenge. Full benefits are available if incarcerated for non-felony and community programs, but if they are in felony convictions, that limits the eligibility to just tuition fees, books, and equipment. But again, the veteran needs to know that, they need to understand that, need to be able to have some support in navigating that. So if your organization, whether in a community corrections or long-term facility or in the judicial department, really need to understand, not to use this as a mitigating factor, but this is another impact that veterans will experience upon incarceration. And so a lot, I definitely want to hand this over to my colleagues, but really just in conclusion, identifying service members, veterans in courts, jails, and prisons can lead to focused support. Learning military culture can help build trust and understanding. Leveraging partnerships like VJO coordinators can link service members, veterans, and their families to services. And then developing basic knowledge about common clinical considerations enhances your ability to outreach and engage when necessary. You can develop SMVF-specific program, whether veterans courts or veteran-focused programs in the judicial space, veterans wards and programs in community corrections, and then veterans cell blocks and dormitories in state and federal correctional facilities. I appreciate the opportunity to share this. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Again, you will be receiving this. I will be able to answer some questions at the end of this, but at this time, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Kelber.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very informative presentation. I have really enjoyed that, as I'm sure the audience has as well. So today I will, and good afternoon, everyone. Today I will tell you more about the two literature reviews we conducted to inform our leaders in the Department of Defense about this association between criminal justice involvement and suicide outcomes. And this originated from the Suicide Prevention and Response Independent Review Committee report that came out a couple of years ago. Some of you may remember it. So in this report, it was noted that 23% of service members who died by suicide had experienced administrative or legal issues. And so this is clearly concerning and something that the committee flagged as something that the DoD should look into more, conduct more research, evaluate it more, and potentially find and implement any preventative strategies that we can do to help the criminal justice involved populations. So as a result of this request, we conducted 2 rapid reviews of the literature, and this is what I'll tell you more about today. So let's take a look at how we did this and what we found. Okay, so these were our research questions for these 2 rapid reviews. So first, is there an association between justice involvement and suicide deaths and attempts? And then we also looked at whether the strength of association differs based on the different types of charges. And then finally, we looked at interventions. What are the interventions that can help these individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system? As I mentioned earlier, we conducted rapid reviews. So this is a type of a literature review. Some of you may be familiar with systematic reviews. Rapid reviews are very similar to systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are ways to synthesize evidence in a way that's reproducible by others, it's transparent, it's a critical synthesis of research evidence on a particular topic. In a rapid review, we accelerate this systematic review methodology a little bit by streamlining or omitting some of the steps in order to produce evidence more quickly. We do that when we have stakeholders that are interested in making some evidence-based decisions on a particular topic area. In this rapid review, we started with clearly stated objectives and predefined eligibility criteria for selection of studies. And this is what you typically would do in a systematic review. But unlike systematic review, where we search multiple databases, here we used abbreviated search strategy. We searched for studies in only one database, in this case, PubMed. We did not formally assess the quality of the studies. And in systematic reviews, sometimes you will conduct meta-analyses. In rapid reviews, there's no time often to do this, so we just narratively summarize the findings. There's some drawbacks to this approach. You may omit some studies, but typically they reach same conclusions as a systematic review would. Okay, so for the first systematic or rapid review, we looked at this association between criminal justice involvement and suicide. And these are our eligibility criteria for inclusion of studies. So we included peer-reviewed published studies. There were observational studies of adults. So we included any adults. So it could be service members, it could be veterans, or it could be civilians. And in all these studies, the individuals had to have criminal justice system involvement, and that was compared to the individuals with no criminal justice system involvement. And the outcomes we looked at were suicide deaths and attempts. This is a sizable literature. We started with 861 records that we reviewed, and then we ended up including 60 studies that met all our eligibility criteria. Okay, so in terms of the findings, we did find that there is this association between criminal involvement and suicide. It's a positive association, so meaning that for individuals who have contacts in the criminal justice system, they're more likely to be involved, they're more likely to die by suicide or commit suicide compared to those individuals who do not have criminal justice system exposure. And this was pretty consistent across all these 60 studies. However, a couple of things important to note here is, so usually the way these studies looked at this was history of criminal justice involvement. So it could be, history of arrests, probation, parole, having been released from prison, history of convictions. So a lot of different ways to measure this. And also a lot of studies sometimes combined all these different criminal justice outcomes into one category. So we didn't really find any studies, which was kind of the main purpose of this exercise, to find studies that looked at suicide in the aftermath of criminal charges. But we didn't find any of these studies. The studies were more sort of like historical look at criminal justice involvement. And so we don't really know what's the timing of greatest risk for suicide after initiation of criminal investigation. So this is clearly something that more research is needed on and more research is needed to tell us about this. One other set of findings related to types of different crimes. So we found that sexual and violent crimes may be particularly associated with higher suicide rates, but the findings were mixed. So some of the studies found a stronger association for sexual and violent crimes and their association with suicide, but other studies did not find any difference in types of crime in terms of the association with suicide. And I just want to note there was this one Army STARS study conducted with Army soldiers that actually looked at this question in individuals with a history of mental health diagnosis. And for them, the study found that major violent crime was associated with greater likelihood of suicide attempt than non-violent crime. Okay, so just to summarize, there is this positive association between criminal justice involvement and suicide, and I mean positive in a statistical sense. So, so those involved with criminal justice system are more likely to attempt and die by suicide. So this is clearly an important area for interventions, for preventative interventions. However, it can be difficult to intervene with these individuals because causal mechanisms are sometimes not known, or sometimes they're very complex. So it could be a number of different factors, and also some of them we heard about in the previous presentation. So it's personality factors or individual factors like mental health diagnosis, trauma exposure, lack of social support, and some of this interacting with the various social and also criminal justice system factors in contributing both to criminal justice involvement, but also in the suicide risk. So clarifying these relationships would help us with intervening. And also, as I mentioned earlier, timing of greatest risk during the criminal justice process is unclear. If we had more research on this topic, we would be better able to know when is the best timing for interventions. Okay, so speaking of the interventions, so our next rapid review looked at the interventions for justice-involved population. And for this, we found a systematic review that looked at this topic. It was conducted by Carter and colleagues, and it searched the literature from 2000 to 2021. They included 36 studies and 2 unpublished gray literature reports. And this is what they found. So they found 71% of studies that were conducted in adult prisons. So none of them for those detained in custody, bail, parole, or released from prison or detention. So this also indicates another research gap. Also, most of the studies had inconclusive results for suicide attempts or deaths, but there were some interventions that show benefit for related outcomes of suicidal thoughts and behavior. So those were suicide ideation or self-injurious behaviors. And I've listed here some of these interventions that were found to be beneficial. So there were cognitive behavioral interventions, problem solving, peer support interventions, also treatment for severe mental illness, group mindfulness, tailored dialectical behavioral therapy, and also multi-component suicide prevention programs. So while this gives us some beneficial and promising avenues for implementation and for prevention, there's clearly some limitations that I've noted earlier and clearly needs for some more research. However, it's also important to know that these kind of studies are very difficult to do. Suicide is a rare outcome. So in order to do a high quality studies like randomized controlled trials, that's sometimes very difficult to do. You would need a large number of participants, which is sometimes not feasible. And some may argue not even ethical. So there are definitely some limitations that we're working with here. And we've also, just to mention, we've also looked at more recent literature since the Carter Review was published, and we didn't find any original research studies, but we did find a couple of more reviews that have basically corroborated the Carter findings. So sometimes in this case of when the evidence is somewhat limited or lower quality, there's not a lot of good randomized controlled trials, we may have to produce best practices based on the lower quality of the limited evidence. And I just want to mention this about this program. So as we were doing our reviews, we found out about this limited privilege suicide prevention program that is implemented by the U.S. Air Force. And so this is a multi-component program, but one of the aspects of it was particularly relevant here. So there are individuals under investigation for legal problems are assessed, and they're also given greater confidentiality when seeing mental health providers. We found 2 studies that evaluated this larger U.S. Air Force program, and they found decreased risk of suicide after the program was implemented. This is a pre-post study design, so not very strong conclusions can be drawn from these. And it was unclear which program component contributed to the decrease of suicide risk, but it's a clearly a promising avenue for these populations. And just to summarize, there is an association between justice involvement and suicide. So those who are involved with the criminal justice system are more likely to commit suicide or to attempt suicide compared to those without the involvement in the criminal justice system. As I mentioned earlier, more research is needed to understand the causal mechanisms implicated here. And we also need more research on the timing of the greatest risk. We didn't find any explicit evidence-based interventions for the primary outcomes we looked at of suicide deaths and attempts, but benefits for related outcomes have been found, and there are some interventions that can be helpful with these populations. And in this case, it's important to utilize best practices, and some of the approaches, as my colleague Lieutenant Grant will talk about next. And I also wanted to just note before I conclude is that there was a lack of studies on military populations, so we clearly need more studies done with military populations in terms of this topic area. I have included my contact information for anyone that would like to get in touch afterwards, and also our website, a PHCRE website where you can find out a lot more about our work and also about other evidence synthesis. So we do systematic reviews and rapid reviews on a variety of mental health topics. Okay, and now I will turn it over to my colleague, Lieutenant Grant.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Kelber said, my name is Lieutenant Grant, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with Dr. Kelber at the DHA, or Defense Health Agency Psychological Health Center of Excellence. Dr. Kelber works on the research execution team, so they're the team doing all the really, really smart stuff, and I work on the research adoption team. And so we take all that smart stuff and turn it into resources and tools that are translatable and usable for the populations that we serve. So some of the formats for those resources are clinical support tools, infographics, written articles, blogs, among others. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight two of the clinical support tools that our team has published on the resources that came out of the projects that Dr. Kelber just reviewed for all of us. So the first of those two is, let me make sure I can change slides. There we go. The first of those two is supporting service members facing disciplinary or legal action, a resource map for line leaders. Now, I realize this is relatively small, so what I'm going to do here, oh, somebody's already dropped them in the chat. Thank you for that. What I'm going to do is review this document with you all so you can see how we take the information that is collected throughout the system, throughout the research that is done, and then put it into these formats so that they are digestible for, again, the communities or populations that we're serving. In this case, this is specifically for line leaders or those in the military who are serving as those first line supervisors, unit leaders to service members. So one of the things that we really wanted to prioritize within this resource is understanding where to go for support. So we know that different disciplinary or legal issues are, or all disciplinary and legal issues are not the same for any individual, and the reactions that an individual or service member has will be different based on what they're experiencing and their own lived experience and past experiences. So one of the best ways that leaders can support their service members is by knowing what resources are available. The infographic that you can kind of see on the slide here, which is the circles within a larger circle, I'm going to walk through that for us all. So it's kind of categorizes supports into three main categories: ongoing supports, situational supports, and transitional supports. So we categorize ongoing supports, such as those from local command or unit chaplains, mental health providers that exist within embedded frameworks, or clinical or military treatment facilities or hospitals, as well as other assets that are available for members who anticipate those longer-term legal or disciplinary issues going on. One thing about military chaplains or embedded chaplains is those folks are specifically trained to provide counseling, and it is not always religious or spiritual in context, but they are there to provide that type of support in a counseling, non-medical system related capacity. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. So those would be for folks who wanted to work with somebody on a more longer term basis. The situational supports are those such as Military One Source, military and family life counselors. I'll describe each of these more momentarily. And those might be a little bit more appropriate for folks or service members who are looking for more short-term or immediate support. All programs have limitations and caveats to those limitations as far as how long they can be engaged with, but these are those first line kind of immediate non-medical interventions for situational supports, especially when periods of stress are really rising. This is common upon being notified of disciplinary action or being involved with any sort of legal issues. The third category would be transitional supports, such as transitioning out of the military or between commands, PCSing. As Mr. France spoke about earlier, vet centers are a good example of that, as well as the In Transition program, which is a Defense Health Agency program I'll describe in more detail in just a moment. And these programs really help folks who are going through periods of transition, access supports, navigate the systems, which can be a bit confusing for folks, and really make sure that they are plugged into the resources that are available while they're going through those transitional or transition periods. Now, this resource, again, is specifically for line leaders, so for leadership. And we know that we want our line leaders to know about all the resources that are available, but they also have to know many, many other things that are not behavioral health or mental health specific. So we want to give them enough information that they can support their service members and those that they are leading, but not enough that overwhelms them or makes them feel as though they have responsibility for stepping into that role of assessment, of providing any sort of clinical care or treatment, but really being there to be a supportive leader to help their service members gain access to those supports as necessary. One of the things that came up that we wanted to highlight within this resource is the different feelings and experiences or reactions a service member may have as they experience the things such as issues with disciplinary issues or legal issues. And that may be feeling abandoned, feeling ostracized by other members of their unit or their community because they don't know what's going on, but they know somebody is facing a potentially significant issue. And then fear of the consequences that comes from those types of issues. So as Dr. Kelber highlighted in her presentation, individuals who are pending disciplinary or legal action may be at a higher risk for suicide, even if no noticeable changes are present in their behaviors or the way they're acting from day to day. So that was really the first page of this first resource. And now I'm going to focus on the second page, but I promise the second page for both resources are the same, so it won't be as long in the second CST that we're covering or clinical support tool I'm covering today. So while not everyone who has legal problems or is under investigation is in crisis or at risk for suicide, an accumulation of risk factors, including legal involvement, may increase suicide risk overall. So again, it's really being aware that this is a risk factor and it can increase risk of suicide or contribute to cumulative risk factors, but it's important to be aware of service members for those leaders who may be facing these issues. So now I'm going to do just a kind of small introduction to the various resources that are present kind of uniformly across the services. And these do vary from service to service, from installation to installation, command to command, based on operations, location, scheduling, and of course, command climate. But these are the staple pieces that build the much larger mental health support system throughout the DoD. So as previously mentioned, I started with the chaplains. So military chaplains are responsible for tending to the spiritual and moral well-being of service members and their families. They are required, at least within the Navy, to provide non-medical. So that what that means is supportive counseling. Non-medical is just the jargon that we use to provide support to service members across any number of presenting concerns. Chaplains, of course, have 100% confidentiality. They don't have to report anything. So they're put in a position of great trust. And they're also great partners to behavioral health and mental health military providers and the system in helping folks navigate that system. On this resource is also another link that can help line leaders or those who use this resource locate chaplains who are based on specific installations. The next resource is the mental health clinic. So that may exist in an independent building, an independent clinic within this context of the system of a military treatment facility or otherwise. And those clinics are the spaces where clinical assessments are conducted by mental health providers as well as behavioral health technicians. As Mr. Franz mentioned earlier, they're the ones who are going to really focus on the clinical issues. The infographic used in the first presentation was really great. It showed in that one circle that the examples given on the above half were clinical issues and the bottom half were non-clinical issues. So that's a great way of depicting the different types of issues and how they might be triaged to the appropriate resource. Again, the clinic is there for the clinical assessment, which would then lead to potentially clinical treatment if that were warranted. The third resource that I mentioned previously is the Military and Family Life Counseling Program. This is one of my favorite programs. Let me just say that. It is extraordinarily underutilized, but I think that's because it is not as socialized as it should be. So military and family life counselors, or MFLACs, as they are all often referred to, are licensed mental health professionals who provide clinical care, again, in that non-medical context. So that's the line that is drawn as far as providing supportive care versus medical care or clinical care. So they can work with service members across a number of issues, common issues issues, adjustment to the military, life stressors, family stressors, military stressors, including stressors that have to do with being involved with the legal or disciplinary systems. They come in two kind of categories. One are installation MFLACs, and those folks are assigned to an installation and they serve service members from any command or any unit within that installation. And then there are the embedded MFLACs who are embedded specifically to a specific unit or a specific command, and they work solely with that community or the set of commands in that larger community. Military OneSource is the next resource, and Military OneSource is I don't want to say one-stop shop, but to a degree, it provides a wide range of resources to help service members navigate different programs within the military and provide different types of supports. One of those supports is also, again, non-medical counseling, that being the broader category. Military OneSource is a great place to go to in order to get assistance in navigating the system of the DoD as well as the behavioral health and mental health system. When a service member calls, chats, or I think call or live chat are the two options, they can connect with somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the consultants who man or staff those lines are there to help that service member navigate what resource is the most appropriate for them. And then depending on that resource, they may actually be able to directly connect them. In the context of behavioral health supports or counseling, they can actually connect folks who are in regions where there is a network connection with a provider who provides behavioral health or mental health support, and they help navigate that for that individual. The next program, which I previously mentioned, was the In Transition program. And In Transition helps service members connect with care. The program was initially set up, I believe, specifically to help service members as they're in any period of transition. So that's PCSing or permanent change of station from one command to another, entering or assessing into the military, or departing from the military in whatever pathway that they are departing or ending their service. In Transition is actually much broader at this time. They will help service members and anybody who has exited service in the period of the last 12 months navigate, again, that broad behavioral health or mental health network of services. It is staffed, again, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by mental health coaches. They do not provide direct care themselves, but they are there to help service members and veterans navigate care and locate resources in whatever area they happen to be in. And then vet centers, I don't have a lot more to add to that because Mr. France covered that so wonderfully at the beginning. The last two resources on this one that I would highlight are 988, which I hope everyone is familiar with, and the Associated Military Veterans Crisis Line, which is a part of the 988 program. The other resource is the Real Warriors Campaign. The Real Warriors Campaign is a public health campaign that is designed to decrease stigma around mental health, increase psychological health literacy, and opening doors to access to care for service members, their families, and veterans. The program really focuses on psychoeducation and psychoeducation and psychological health literacy by creating products and running a campaign that helps folks better understand mental health concepts and better understand their own experiences. It is actually the part of PHCOE, or the Psychological Health Center of Excellence, that developed these CSTs. Now, on to my second one, if that wasn't a mouthful enough. And I promise this is my last slide. This is the supporting service members. Let me see here. I think we actually have, there we go. Sorry about that. This is where to turn when facing disciplinary or legal actions, a mental health resource map for service members. So that first clinical support tool was specifically for line leaders and making sure they were familiar with what to be looking for, when to be looking out for it, and what resources are available for the service members that they lead. Now, this one is a bit different in the context of this is for service members themselves, not that line leaders are not service members, but this is for individuals in the military to utilize to gain some of that same information, but the communication strategy is a bit different here. It's more about a self check here. So the information on the right, that circle of circles, remains the same, but the information on the left, the stress check, is something that was developed specifically so that individuals would know when what to be looking out for when they're facing increased levels of stress, and then increased levels of stress specifically that are related to being engaged with the legal or disciplinary system. So some of the examples included here for the stress check, which is asking yourself the question, are you experiencing any of the following signs of stress? I'm just going to highlight a couple. Increased use of alcohol or other substances, problems with concentration or decision making, and physical symptoms like headaches or stomach upset. All things that are very common reactions to stress, which can be compounded when you are facing potential legal or disciplinary action. So understanding what the manifestation and experience of stress may have during these periods is extremely important. And this tool, again, was really developed within the context of helping the service member kind of understand and normalize their experience, so they may hopefully be better prepared to reach out and ask for help. The last part of this that I'll highlight is the bottom left quadrant, which is when to seek support. And the bottom line is there is never a wrong time to seek support. The Department of Defense has a vast plethora of resources that provides mental health support across a number of entities, programs, and otherwise. And so we just really want to make sure that we are encouraging service members to get support as they feel ready and in need. And I know I spoke really fast, and I think I'm 1 minute over. And so with that, I will hand it over to Ms. Wright. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Lieutenant Grant. Thank you, Dr. Kelber and Dwayne France, for all of the great information that you shared today. It's a lot of information. We have quite a few questions, and we have some time to address those questions now from the audience. If you have any questions and you haven't already asked them, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A pod down at the bottom of your screen. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with one of the earlier questions in our webinar. This was directed toward Dwayne France, so I'm just going to cue you up for that. The question is, I'm curious if you see a consistent pattern of the implicit aspects of military culture across generations, loyalty, sacrifice, etc. Do you think these trend the same between veterans of Vietnam or Gulf era versus more recent OIF, OEF veterans?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. It really speaks to the cross-generational nature of military service, and probably the cross-generational nature of what people are seeing in the criminal justice system. I know that when I was working in the Colorado 4th Judicial District, we had veterans from Vietnam, post-Vietnam era, Cold War era in the 80s, Gulf War era, up to current OIF, OEF veterans. And while every caveat is to say, you can't make broad sweeping generalizations about veterans as a whole, because whenever I say something, you're going to think of a veteran that is the exception to this particular rule. But I would say, yes, in general, sort of these military values of duty, honor, commitment, and even subcultures, right? A very specific subculture in the Marines, right? And I once heard a Marine said that every Marine has 10 minutes on the beachhead of another Marine's soul. So it doesn't matter when you served, where you served, if you were a fellow Marine, there's an instant connection there. So I think that there is, or has been demonstrated to be sort of these internalized values. Each branch has their own values, and even maybe even across, like special forces across branches might have a very similar value system. But I would say, yes, they typically do go beyond just one particular era of veterans.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. This next question that I'm going to ask, I'd like to direct towards Dr. Kelber. It was in response to one of your slides that was talking about 23% of service members who die by suicide have administrative or legal issues. And the question was, how are those suicide rates compared to the general population of people in the criminal justice system? So again, how does the suicide rate among service members compare to the general population who are engaged in the criminal justice system?
That's actually a great question. We haven't looked at that very carefully as we were doing our reviews, and it's complicated. You know, the prevalence numbers are complicated by different types of criminal justice exposure, as I was saying. So, it varies widely, but I would have to look at it again and get back to you. So if you want to contact me, I will look into it. But I can't remember off the top of my head whether they're similar or different from the service member population.
Thank you, Dr. Kelber. And I wanted to acknowledge there was a couple of questions related to the VA benefits. And since we do not have a VA representative on this call, we're not going to be able to answer specifically those questions, but those are noted. So thank you for asking them. Another question that's kind of a theme within the questions that we've received so far centers around family. So there's a number of them. I'm going to do a two-parter. Is there an intervention with emphasis on family reunification? And then the second part of that question are, what are some resources for family members?
I can probably start off. I think it is obviously necessary. I highlighted relationships as critical. And so if someone is leaving an incarcerated setting, having strong social supports is very significant. I think really it would be better that any family reunification intervention would work if the providers understand the military veteran culture. So it's really about learning about military veteran culture. What are some of the unique aspects? What are some of the unique challenges to military and veteran life that may exacerbate or may alleviate some of the barriers to family reunification? And so I think really it's not to say what are some unique interventions for families of service members, veterans. It's more of, are those providers providing those interventions understanding military and veteran culture?
Thank you. Dr.
I think Lieutenant Grant. Sorry.
Grant.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm not aware of any specific to reunification as it relates to being involved in the criminal justice system, but I will highlight just a few family resources for service members in general, where, as Mr. France had spoken to, you would want to find someone who has cultural competency and experience in these very specific processes and issues. But Military OneSource, as I highlighted before, has a number of resources that are available for family members, dependents. The family support centers or the fleet centers that I mentioned earlier for the Navy, they are also where all of the programs live. So there are a number of programs, again, specific for dependents. There was once a program called Focus, and this is, again, more broadly for families in general, that I think was actually subsumed under the MFLAC program, and it was really specific about building family resiliency, especially as folks are preparing for different military duties, PCSs, deployments, all of that. So again, not super specific to the criminal justice system, but the resources would be there in a general sense for mental health and behavioral health from programs such as Military OneSource and the MFLAC program.
Thank you, Lieutenant Grant. Building off of the questions around families, another question that came in was centered around stigma. What type of stigma is attached to the service member if family members access mental health services?
I see Lieutenant Grant nodding. Do you want to
go for it? Go for it.
I think, again, this is another unique aspect of military culture in that military families serve alongside their service members. And sometimes family members take on sort of the I don't want to say necessarily the rank, but the understanding that they may have a certain standing or position within a unit or something like that. Again, I think stigma is really best seen as a barrier or a reason to not seek mental health care. And sometimes I've seen some spouses or some service members that may not want their children to go to care because they think it might reflect poorly on them. Of course, it doesn't. I think that's really what we've seen over the last 5 years, is really having these conversations about these are normal aspects of what we did. I was a company first sergeant at Fort Carson in 2010, made it very clear that I was going to marriage therapy with my spouse through Military OneSource as an active duty service member to foot stomp Lieutenant Grant's resources. But I made it very clear that I was doing that in response to difficulties arising from my deployments. And so I think it's really is some of that stigma may sort of rub off or may be associated with someone in the family related to their military service. But again, it's just really being able to counteract that stigma and overcome that negative bias that'll help.
I would add on, I agree with all of that. And the only thing that I would add is two things. One, having a leader demonstrate and speak openly about their own experience and the reasons why they are seeking support carries so much weight and makes so much cultural change for the units and the service members they're working with. And the second thing I would say is, in my limited experience, and not generalizable by any means, it's when folks do delay the seeking of care by a spouse or a child, a dependent in any capacity, and then things worsen or things get to that level of crisis where it becomes a little bit more problematic overall. So I think that, again, that prevention piece that Dr. Kelber spoke to and being ahead of it and getting engaged with services and normalizing being engaged with services really does address that stigma. I can share in my own experience, I have not had the experience of any service member I've worked with. Literally, I mean, I went on a ship around the world and then I was in San Diego and Hawaii, so terrible places to live. But I've never seen a case where a dependent accessing service had a negative toll on that service member. It was that good communication with command and having a command that was behavioral health forward, supportive, really engaged and understanding where things went right.
Thank you, Lieutenant Grant. Another question from the chat. Is there specific training that correctional or detention officers would benefit from dealing with this population when they are incarcerated? Are there any training recommendations that you have?
I think, again, really military culture training in general. Again, the links that I shared, the Center for Deployment Psychology is a very good resource. PsychArmor is a very good resource. So really just understanding if the correctional officers or detention officers don't have lived experience in the military, taking some of these training, understanding more about why this particular inmate or why this particular resident is acting in this particular way, really learning about that military culture. And it could be in a positive way. This individual is always showing up on time or being where they're supposed to be. But I think that really those military culture training resources, as well as finding local resources within your community. I'm sure there are a lot of community providers or even community service or veteran service organizations that would be willing to engage with correctional officers to provide some of that sort of live support if they want.
Great. Thank you. Another question from the audience, and I recognize we're running low on time, but I'd like to take one or two more questions. Are there any, sorry, I just lost the question. Are there any, or is there any focus on helping the LGBTQIA community that you can share?
Again, I think this is a really great example of intersectional identities. Understanding that every service member and veteran with their military culture identity is intersectional with their lived experience their family of origin and things like that. There are some unique challenges with the LGBTQ plus veterans. Really, we think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Many veterans who were discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell before that was repealed have characterization discharge that may not be eligible for some services, right? So even though that has changed in the most recent years, the idea or the story that had been the case might keep them from seeking resources. So I think that really it goes back to that first question of identifying somebody in the LGBTQ plus community. Had they ever served, there might be some intersectional aspects, but it's really about learning about military culture in addition to that intersectional identity.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll close out. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of the questions today. Dr. Kelber, could you please mention the 2 gaps in your research that you mentioned are most needed?
Yes, so the causal mechanism of the association between justice involvement and suicide. So I feel like more research is needed to understand that better, because it could be complicated. It could be a number of factors, like the mental health factors, previous trauma, social support, stress you experience during incarceration, so during the criminal justice process. So those are all the factors that can contribute to suicide, but also some of them can contribute to actual criminal justice involvement itself. So just understanding this mechanism better, how these interplay of these factors and how they affect both criminal justice involvement and suicide outcomes is important. And then the second one would be the timing of the greatest risk during the criminal justice process. So we don't know what's the greatest risk. Is it at the beginning of when individuals are initiating their criminal justice journey, or is it when they're incarcerated? Is it when they're convicted? So kind of like this timing of the process of the risk in the criminal justice process.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all of these wonderful questions and for the discussion, and thank you to our presenters for your time and expertise. I really appreciate you being here with us today. We're coming to an end of our time for this presentation. As mentioned at the beginning, there's a certificate of attendance for this webinar. If you're interested in downloading that for your personal use, you can download that now from the chat box. There'll be a document uploaded there. You will see our last poll for today popping up as well if you would like to provide any input or would like related information in addition to an additional TA or other areas. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you haven't signed up for the Gaines listserv, then I encourage you to sign up. There's a link on the screen. Just enter the link into your favorite web browser or scan the QR code, and it'll take you to a place to enter your information, and you can make sure to stay up to date with all of the Gaines Center activities. So I'd like to just thank you all again for your participation in today's webinar. For each of our presenters, Lieutenant Grant, Dr. Kelber, Mr. France, thank you so much for being here today. If you have any other questions or comments, the Gaines Center's direct contact is here on the website. You can go to samhsa.gov/Gaines Center, or there's a phone number to directly reach the Gaines Center. Goodbye and have a great afternoon, everyone.